Hello and welcome back to Antecedents.org. I actually want to do another follow-up video on the topic that I covered last night having to do with emotional hierarchies. So right now, basically in the middle of a series of videos that I'm constructing having to do with fallacies, logical arguments, and now we've parlayed into emotional hierarchies. I started this series first talking about a fallacy which I call the fallacy of historicism, or as I said in the previous video, you could think of the fallacy of sequentialism, and that's just thinking that events in series should always be related to each other or have some kind of connotation. Again, as I said in that video, it's kind of a correlation causation dichotomy there. I talk more about that in that video. That's the first video. The next video I made on that was having to do with emotional hierarchies. So look more on that. That just has to do with which values and emotions that are privileged within a certain perspective. But last night, after I made that video, I actually, in thinking about this topic, which is what's nice about doing these things, is they get you kind of get your mind on these ideas, and you start thinking of ways to articulate these things and discuss them. Again, as I said in my previous videos, I will eventually go over the most known fallacies, the most common and most cited first. I'll probably go over the ones that we use in academia the most, and then go over the rest of them. If you're wondering why I always give you a different number about it, I always say 10 to 15, is because there's people add on to it all the time. There's not really an official list per se, but there are ones that are used in a more professional setting, in the academic setting, rather than there's some that are just kind of colloquial. You can get lists of 20, you can get lists, I think I've seen a list of 100 of them even. But I will get to making a video on that topic, but I actually wanted to share something today which I thought was going to be really important in this discussion, actually. And it's something that I wrote, and I actually have an audio of it, so I'll make a video essay of this too, so you can listen to it. The audio of this reading is about 5 minutes, a little over 5 minutes. It's entitled "The Nature of Philosophy and Its Rules." Okay. Now, I was trying to get across with this, and this is how it correlates to this discussion. This discussion was started when an individual, a commenter on the channel, was curious if I could expound on ways to look at argumentation and the foundations of argumentation, and picking out logical fallacies. Of course, first way to do that is to get familiar with the logical fallacies, but then also to do an analysis of logic and argument and see what we're really trying to pick apart. Now, what I want to talk about today here is the nature of philosophy and its rules, because this is what has to do with what I call the philosophical antecedents. This is something that isn't talked too much about in the realm of philosophy too much, but as you get deeper into it, you realize that there's some rules that we're always trying to follow. At least there were when we were doing strict Western philosophy, pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. We've since gone away from doing philosophy in that vein, at least in a global sense, since the rise of postmodern theory and such, in critical theory. So philosophy is not always done on this right. Philosophy, since the time of post-structuralism, post-modernism, has actually challenged these kind of foundations, but that's a discussion for a different time. I just want to be clear of where my perspective on this is coming from, and where these tenets have been used and where they're coming from. They're the traditional rules of philosophy, or they're the traditional rules that you can take out of the kind of the discourse and the attitude that has been fostered by philosophers throughout time. Like I said, pre and post Enlightenment, really all the way up to post-structuralist kind of movement, which would be anywhere between basically like the 1960s and going forward. So what is a philosophical antecedent? And that's what we want to talk about. Why do I want to talk about philosophical antecedents? An antecedent is basically just something that comes before something else, right? So why do I want to talk about this? Well, because if we're wanting to talk about logic, and if we're wanting to talk about how do we understand arguments and how do we understand fallacies, well, we have to see first what are we looking for, right? If we're looking for an error, we have to be looking for something that is complete or something that is right? Something that is good or organized, right? If we're looking for something negative, we're looking also for something positive, right? So we have to think of what we're actually looking for in trying to discern where fallacies lie and how arguments are founded, and what we're looking for in that kind of pursuit. So to do that, I think it's very helpful to even look at, again, what I call the nature of philosophy and its rules, but it can be actually applied to this discussion as well, to the nature of logic and argumentation, right? So again, I have this, it's actually on my personal website because I have a lot of content in different places, right? So if you've watched any of my other videos, I've mentioned before that I am a musician by profession, and also do a couple other things. But so I have different kinds of content. Some of it's on my music sites, some of it's at the symposium, some of it's on my farm site. But at any rate, I'll make a video essay on there so you could listen to it if you want to listen to a shorter version of what I'm going to tell you here, and I might even publish this somehow on the at the symposium .org. At the symposium, I try to leave for more academic style papers, which this is close to an academic kind of ish paper. The stuff I put on other mediums is because they're not as academic, they're just more train of thought, just kind of trying to get ideas out for the average reader, not necessarily an academic paper with all the citations and such and history. So what nature of philosophy and its rules. Okay, so we're going to say here that philosophy has some rules. And why do I say that? And I'm not saying this to be restrictive, but to say that philosophy has some kind of antecedents, that if we're thinking about the structure of something, if we're thinking about philosophy, we're thinking about a certain aim, right? Philosophers have a certain aim. We're not just, a lot of times people think that philosophy is just thinking about life and coming up with ideas about it, but it's not really that way. Philosophy, the Western philosophy, has always followed a certain trajectory, and it's always had to do, again, much less in the case, since we're in the philosophic term now kind of in a post-structural era or a post-modern era. So we're not going to be as adherent to some of these tendencies, but philosophy, how it's been done, and I think philosophy at its best coheres to these 5 basic rules, as does logic. So I'll go over these antecedents, so the philosophical antecedents. Number 1, the motivation or the motive of the philosophy must aspire to or inhabit the nearest and most practical good for all people. Now, we might take that, again, that's something that we've always taken for granted. I mean, if you look at many of the Stoic philosophers, if you go back to the Greek philosophers, that's always kind of what they were doing, right? And that's kind of where a lot of where Western philosophy starts, right? And we take it for granted that we're just postulating ideas about what's best for human existence. But that's one of the first primary motives of philosophy, and that's where even the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard would conjecture that philosophy is actually a positive venture, right? Because sometimes philosophers have been known to be very negative because they're critiquing things oftentimes, but they're critiquing things actually for the betterment of themselves, their ideas, and in the long run society, or the betterment of their ideas and the betterment of the ideas that are in the academy, and the betterment of the ideas in the academy will lead to the betterment of societies. Is basically the is a trajectory of why philosophers do what they do and why they're concerned about what they're concerned about, and how that trickles down into affecting a broader frame of people. So that's the first one. So it has to have an aspiration or to inhabit the nearest and most practical good. Okay? Number 2, biological coherence. So again, what we're looking for when we're talking about argumentation, that's what we're always kind of looking for. In the back of our minds, we don't realize it, but if someone says something that seems fallacious to us, it's probably because it goes against one of these 5 rules. It doesn't aspire to the nearest or most practical good, so you get called out on that in your argument, right? Number 2, it could be not biologically coherent. What does that mean to be biologically coherent? It means that it has to respect the uncovered and self-evident truths, needs, and functions of human beings, and where possible, that of the entire world. And that's why philosophy can be hard sometimes. That's why there's not as many philosophical claims. Philosophical claims that can be very hard to come up with. That's why we just have 5 here that seem that are pretty strong, but that's why there's only 5 of them, right? This is the whole problem with philosophy is a sort of science. It's a soft science, right? But it is a sort of science. And even in the sciences, we see how rigorous science has to be to come up with rules or laws, right? It's hard to come up with these things, and it's hard to abide by, right? Because if we're looking for something that has to respect these self-evident truths and needs and functions of human beings where possible, and that also reflect that in the entire world. So it has to be global. See, you're looking for things that are global. That's usually why it's so hard for philosophers to make claims, and that's why sometimes people think of philosophers to be too open-ended, but that's because they are very cautious about making claims, because if they're not what we call universalizable, meaning if they can't be applied on a universal scale, then we know we can't say that as a general statement, because it can't be universalized. So number 3, physical coherence, and this will kind of follow number 2. Physical coherence, that means that it has to respect and work within the limits of what we know to be true and self-evident by the likes of the material world. Okay, so your ideas have to have respect for the material world. Again, not in just philosophy, but even in your arguments, right? If you say something that is counter to the laws of gravity, right, then we know that, okay, we're going to challenge that idea because it's not reflected in the self-evident truths of what we know about the natural world. Number 4, historical coherence, okay? A contemporary philosophy or critic of a philosophical position must not avow their own claims without engaging with prior persons or texts which have covered the same topic. In the event of engaging with or responding to prior ideas or texts, the philosopher expands the discourse, hopefully in a meaningful way. So we shouldn't just have ideas before we try to reflect, before we look at other forms of those ideas that might happen in the past, right? So the philosophers typically are always looking backwards, so it's usually why they have a good sense of history. This is also why I mentioned to you the Stoics and the Greeks. So I'm even in talking to this, I'm trying to adhere to these rules, right? And again, logical fallacies. If someone says something that we know that's out of step with history, then their idea might be challenged. Of course, there's many events in life and history, so it's there could be things, 2 or 3 or 4 things that are true all at the same time. So number 5, okay, number 5 is societal coherence, which kind of has to do with number 1. It has to maintain societal coherence, meaning it has to purvey a philosophy or a critique that is helpful, supports, or furthers a state of civility, right? Because that's, again, what philosophers are looking for. It kind of relates. Number 1 and number 5 are very related, but it has to do with having a critique, not just to have a critique. We're usually having a critique having to do with, well, X, Y, and Z, because this might be a better way to look at this, or this might be an observation that was left out of the discourse, which is not good, because if we leave that observation out of the discourse of philosophy or any other discipline, then that might be harmful to the betterment of the human race. That's actually something that's happening right now. There's actually, when I started this video and started talking about living now in the post-structuralist kind of era of philosophy, that's very much a huge sector of the academic institution is now coming against that kind of idea and trying to protect and trying to bring back some of these critiques that they feel like, well, some of these ideas that we're having nowadays might not be actually to the betterment of society and all peoples. So again, we have to check that. So philosophers don't do necessarily anything different from what, some political pundits or political writers or just the average person does when thinking about how they want to live their own lives and how they treat their neighbors and their families. It's just that we do it in a more technical way, and we do it in an academic way in which we're reviewing the words of people in the past and different texts, just because that's the way the discipline goes, right? That's the venture, right? The venture is not necessarily an auditory venture. It's not one where we're just necessarily want to talk about ideas or convince people to talk about ideas or influence people to talk about ideas. It's one where you want to document the ideas and explain your ideas through how they correlate through figures and ideas in history. I hope that helped in adding to the conversation on fallacies and argumentation. Again, I will leave a link to this video of my video essay having to do with this topic. Again, I hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.